Welcome to Proles of the Round Table.
Welcome to Proles of the Round Table. Tonight we're here with Justin, Ezra, and Jeremy. I'm your host, 8Hop. I want to give a quick shout out to Old Man Soros. Thanks for allowing us to purchase these mics. That check finally came in.
Yeah, we were...
Fucking year and a half.
It was pretty rough there on the first episode, but thanks to those hashtag Soros bucks, we now have 4 microphones. Living lavish over here.
Yeah, well, I mean, Soros spares no
expense.
No expense. Not when it comes to the left.
Also, we would like to thank the alternative left, the punk left, and the post-punk left for supporting this show. We're still kind of waiting to hear more from the goth left and the electronic left. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the suppression of leftist movements in American history. Plenty to cover there, plenty of relevance to modern history, what's going on in the U.S. today in the suppression of the J20 protesters and organizers. And I would add also the almost promotion of right-wing organizing and protesting and militant or quasi-militant movements. Those seem to be either promoted or encouraged by the state.
At best ignored.
Yes.
And I think it's important and it matters because a lot of the criticisms of communist countries is that they don't allow political dissidents to speak their minds. They don't allow disagreement with the party line. But the reality is that even here in the United States, where we are a quote-unquote democracy and we have freedom of the press and freedom of speech, theoretically, in practice, not so much.
Justin, let's talk about the history of the labor movement.
Okay. There's a long history, a very bloody history, which is swept under the rug and not talked about at all in your high school history books. You can dabble a little bit in college, but it's not addressed very thoroughly. Unfortunately, it's the same story over and over again, but I will highlight 3 of what I see as the major moments, the turning points in labor history. The first one starts back in 1892 with the Homestead Strike, also known as the Pinkerton Rebellion. This happened in 1892 in the town of Homestead, Pennsylvania. There was a major steelworks called the Steelworks of Homestead. It was owned by none other than Andrew Carnegie. The man who ran the factory, however, was Henry Clay Frick. He was that was the name of the boss there. So as they are coming up on their collective bargaining agreement between Steelworks of Homestead and the Amalgamated Men, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, as they're coming up along the end of their bargaining agreement, the mill itself is putting out 4 times the production that it was when the original bargaining agreement was made.
Right.
And so understandably, the workers and the union are trying to bargain for higher wages.
Wait, so what you're saying is as production increases, the workers should receive more money?
It's kind of a wacky idea.
Yeah, it's strange.
But of course, Frick would have nothing to do with that. So the second that it was brought up in the agreements, this is before the agreement had even ended, he cut wages by 22% immediately.
Wait, so you're saying that as production increased, they cut wages?
Yes, correct. It was a punishment.
It's almost like the market isn't actually efficient.
All right. So there were letters back and forth to Carnegie, so he's not innocent in any way, shape, or form. I'm not going to go down that road. He had originally said that he wasn't going to negotiate at all, that they were going to get whatever they got. And even though that was happening, while this was happening, he was building a barbed wire fence around the factory.
Oh good.
Yeah.
Freedom.
Yes. I'm sure it was for the security of the workers inside that factory.
America!
Right. So while they're bargaining, he's building a literal barbed wire fence. And after 29 days in which they're going at this, they couldn't come to an agreement. And so on June 28th, he locked the workers out of the mill because he refused to raise their wages. They refused to work. And, the union saw this as like a bad deal. They're not going to accept it. The 22% reduce in wages, understandably. So Frick, being the moderate that he was, he put snipers in the towers. He blasted them with water cannons with scalding hot water in it. Maybe reminiscent of the, Dakota Access Pipeline.
Cold water in the winter.
In the winter,
much
yes.
like hot water in the summer.
Yeah, exactly. So as the surrounding towns started to hear about this, this was when worker solidarity was actually a thing.
Yeah.
They started striking in their plants that were also Carnegie plants. They were, standing in solidarity with the Homestead Strike. So the union set up men to stand at the docks and the entryways to the town, and they would question anybody that came in the town because they did not want any strikebreakers or scabs showing up to take their jobs. So because this was effective, Frick goes to the local sheriff. His name was McCleary. And he says, you need to step in. You got to shut this down. This is bad for business. I need to get my supervisors in there at least in order to keep the factory running. And so the sheriff, like the good bootlicker that he was, he takes his 12 deputies. He goes around town and he hammers up these posters declaring that the strike is illegal and saying that if they continue to stop the supervisors from being able to reach their factory, then they would be hauled off to jail. Well, the reaction was that the union workers and their families, they corralled the deputies, all 12 of them, onto a boat and sent them on their way to Pittsburgh.
Bye.
So yes, that was the reaction to that. So
the good old days. Make America revolutionary again.
Exactly. So because, of course this was before the police were militarized. So Carnegie and Frick get together and they're like, listen, these cops aren't getting it done. We need to pay the Pinkertons. They pumped a bunch of money into the Pinkertons. For those of you that don't know, it's the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which was essentially a mercenary group that was paid to shut down unions and strikes. And
very relatable to the Freikorps or...
Yes. So the Pinkertons, there was a river that was running alongside the mill. Their plan was to send Pinkertons down the river. They would then unload onto the shores and then open the gates to the mill and let everybody in. But the strikers had already heard about this. And so at 2:30 a.m., the workers rang the plant whistle, and thousands of men, women, and children showed up at the plant and refused to allow the Pinkertons to come off of the boats.
It's like a reverse of that like Flintstones thing.
They're not going home. They're coming to work. So the Pinkertons came down on these boats, and there was a standoff for about 10 minutes where they're like, what's happening? What's happening? One of the Pinkertons fires a rifle, ends up killing one of the strikers, and then a firefight ensues. And just in this one firefight alone, there are 2 lives on each side that are lost, 11 wounded. So after that, a lot of the younger Pinkertons were like, yeah, nope, thanks. And so they jumped ship and were like, not risking my life for this. But a lot of the older veterans, they stayed on, their honor and duty and their paycheck. And
Dumb.
and so they had this firefight for a little bit longer. The surrounding towns, hearing about what was happening, sent 5,000 people. These are workers. Sent 5,000 workers to the Homestead plant to stand in solidarity with the Homestead strikers, armed to the teeth.
Tight.
Yes. At this point, the union leader, Hugh O'Donnell, is negotiating furiously with Frick and trying to get some sort of resolution here to try to get people to not lose their lives or whatever it's going to be, to no success up to this point. The firefight continues. Hours of debate go on between the sheriff, the union leader, and Frick, and eventually their agreement was that the Pinkertons were supposed to be disarmed, sent on a train, and then tried for murder for killing the...
As they should be.
As they should be. So that was the reason that they broke the strike. Okay, that was the deal that they had come to. Of course, as was what happens with cops, they were disarmed, they were sent on a boat and shipped to Pittsburgh, but there was no charge of murder.
Right.
There was nothing that happened. And in the end, Governor Patterson, who was also heavily funded by Andrew Carnegie, shockingly, sends in 4,000 troops to shut down what remains of the strike, which at this point had diminished significantly because they felt like they had gotten what they needed, and headed back, and ends up dissipating and going along its way. An interesting side note, Alex Berkman, who had no ties to the town, the mill, or the union, organized an assassination of Frick with his lover and famed anarchist Emma Goldman.
I mean, he deserved it.
Yes. Where they basically snuck into his office, stabbed and shot him, even though he survived.
Right.
Berkman spent 22 years in prison for that conviction.
Jesus. Yeah.
But the Pinkertons, of course, did not spend a day.
Right. And kind of building off of that, that was the point at which Emma Goldman gave up on the concept of the propaganda of the deed, which is, it's not purely an anarchist tactic, but it's largely an anarchist tactic where you do things to awaken class consciousness or whatever purely because it's a spectacle. And that was the entire point of that, was they were going to kill Frick as like a, not because it was going to change the material conditions. Frick was going to be replaced with another boss of the mill. But Emma Goldman was like, it didn't work. He lived. And now my boyfriend is in prison for 22 years. So we are going to lose more supporters to prison sentences than we are going to gain from doing these things. So let's not do this anymore.
All right. And so the next thing that I want to talk about, the next topic I wanted to talk about, is the Haymarket Massacre, which happened around the same time. Basically, the backstory being that this takes place in Chicago. And in 19th century Chicago, it was the industrial hub of, as it was really until very recently. Well, in 1872, there was the Great Chicago Fire, as people might have learned in history books, that claimed the lives of 120 to 300 people, depending on the statistics that you listen to, and left 100,000 people homeless. So obviously this left a big burden upon the population. And so they banded together, they created a socialist collective, and everybody was taken care of for the rest of their lives. Right?
Yeah, that's what happened.
That's what happened? Yeah. No. The wealthy people in town were like, this is probably going to be bad for us, so let's start a charity, because charity trumps solidarity. So they set up a disaster relief fund, essentially, the rich people in town, to kind of alleviate some of this. But
they're heroes.
But people started finding out that this relief fund was being funneled back into the pockets of the wealthy. So they were donating money to this fund that went back around to them. So thousands of workers came to protest this gross, disgusting abuse of charity funds that they desperately needed. And they were pushed into a tunnel by police and then beat with batons.
Oh.
Because yes, police are definitely there for your safety. Yes, that's why they exist.
Yes. Oh, it gets better. It gets better. There is more. So as the local wealthy folk in the town started to realize that, I don't know, maybe the workers were going to rise up, they started preparing for things. So one of the local cops, John Bonfield, and the captain of the Chicago Police Department, Michael Schnack, went to the owners of local businesses, and they were like, hey, if you give us some money, we will protect you.
You mean like a mob protection racket?
It's almost like that. The amount of money that they collected in this slush fund from local businesses was $100,000, which in today money is $1 million.
Holy.
So this handful of Chicago police officers raised $1 million to protect local businesses.
What stand-up citizens?
At the same time as there are 100,000
freedom of
homeless
assembly, freedom of speech. It's in the Constitution, and yet it's not being upheld by the law.
Are you ready? Here's the next piece.
Oh,
it
God.
leads in perfectly.
But wait, there's more.
But wait. So the
For only 1995, we can increase your exploitation twice.
2 times the exploitation. All right.
And if you call now.
Despite the fact that the 8-hour workday was already on the books in federal law, it was not being enforced, and Chicago businesses were not using it. And so the Chicago workers were getting very frustrated at this fact. And so on May 1st, a local labor organizer and socialist, his name was August Spees, led 80,000 workers down Michigan Avenue in protest of the unenforced
80,000.
80 fucking thousand.
Holy hell.
and the still unenforced 8-hour workday. So on May 3rd, after he had organized this protest, people started striking. So on May 3rd, the strikers were attacked by police and shot, and 2 were killed.
What about the freedom of assembly that we have protected under the Constitution?
Business always trumps freedom of assembly.
Really?
So on the next morning, Spees and other labor organizers at the time organized a protest of police brutality because they were like, hey, we just got killed by literal cops.
I have a feeling the police didn't take that too well.
We'll get there. So Adolph Fisher, who was another local activist, he also had a local leftist newspaper similar to, I don't know, Leon Trotsky. And so he printed these flyers to go out, and after Spees read the flyer, he immediately was like, no, you got to reprint this, because on the flyer, the original flyer, the words were, working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force. And he had already talked to the sheriff and had told them about the protest, and the sheriff had said, that's fine, you can protest, I just don't want any violence. And so seeing that these were on the papers, he's like, no, we can't do that. Like, reprint them. So the Chicago Tribune at the time, I'm sure they're very rational now, but at the time they were well known for sensationalizing any leftist activity. And so they had a hold of one of these flyers and they printed it in their paper.
Right.
Okay. So the previous cops, Shack and Bonfield, who had raised $1 million to protect everybody.
The protection fund. It's like libertarianism. Like you don't get police and fire protection. You have to pay out of pocket individually. It's like that, right?
Exactly like
Which
that.
is freedom.
America. All right. So these guys, they go to the local, to the CPD, which is the Chicago Police Department, the chief, and they're like, we need all these police officers as many as we can get. So they get 176 policemen on hand as a precaution. All right, now things get a little crazy. So we're going to go through the timeline. At 7:30 that evening, 2,500 people gather in Haymarket Square, which is a local, it was just an intersection, basically.
I was just there.
Basically.
It was cool.
Oh, were you? You were actually there.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was in Chicago.
Was there a plaque?
Yeah, there's like a
nice.
memorial. Nearby.
You can buy T-shirts and
Yeah.
give capitalist money
You-
for.
Yes.
So at 7:30 that evening, 2,500 people are in Haymarket Square. Now, Spees is the first speaker. He arrives, he gives this hour-long speech. At 9 p.m., an anarchist, Albert Parsons, took the stage for a short period of time and was followed by Samuel Fielden, a socialist anarchist organizer and Methodist preacher. After
Wait
20
a second. I thought that socialists were against religion, and
It's the opiate of the masses. Yes. So, on a serious note, there was a huge Christian socialist
I have
movement at this
a
time.
I have a fucking gigantic tattoo on my leg, which is from the cover of a book called Capital and Labor, which was written by a Baptist preacher who was a leader of the socialist movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. So
Yeah. It was
anyway.
a thing, and unfortunately got divorced later. But anyway, so after 25 minutes of this preacher speaking, the police in attendance ran to a nearby inspector, Bonfield, of course, and said that the speaker was using inflammatory language. Okay, and that
freedom
is
of speech? What about freedom of
It's
speech,
inflammatory.
Justin? Oh, you're right.
All right,
You
Jeremy.
can't shout fire in a crowded theater.
Yes. So, upon his shock at hearing this news, Bonfield marched 167 officers to the gathering and told the crowd to disperse. Now, Fielden, who is the one giving the speech, turns to the officer issuing the dispersal decree and says, this is a peaceful meeting. What are you doing? Why are you trying to break this up? Freedom of assembly. And before he could respond, there was a bomb that went off. And the bomb was detonated in front of the line of police. One officer was killed, but upon doing so, the crowd opened fire. The cops opened fire at the workers. They opened fire back. 6 more cops died. Later on, the witnesses would say that the cops all died by friendly fire.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting factoid.
Serve and protect.
Yes. So anyway, the following day, martial law is declared. Hundreds are arrested, and eventually 8 were brought to trial. So the judge was openly hostile from the very beginning. There was no question about whether he was a neutral party or not.
Right.
So Spees, who had already left the gathering, so he gave his speech and he left. Fielden, who was the one talking to the cop at the end, and alleged bomb maker Louis Ling, who was, they just found, I think they found bomb making stuff in his house, but I feel like I can't remember the exact story, but I think he was somewhere else at the time. George Engel, who had helped plan the rally but didn't attend, so was never there. Michael Schwab, who'd given a speech to another group in another area, but prosecutors would testify could have inspired someone to violence. Could have inspired someone to violence.
In a theoretical alternate universe.
Yes, exactly. Albert Parsons and the typesetter, Adolph Fisher. The typesetter.
The person who took the letters and put them in the printing press in the order that he was told to.
Yes.
Jesus
they were all
Christ.
hung. All of them hung.
Killed
Literally,
for typesetting.
Literally killed. Here's the kicker. Pacifist Oscar Neebe, whose only direct connection to all of this was a $2 donation he had made to buy the printing press for the leftist newspaper that had printed the literature, was given 15 years in prison. So there's an interesting quote by Neebe that he said after he was convicted. He said, "There's no evidence to show that I was connected with the bomb throwing or that I was near it or anything of that kind. So I am only sorry, Your Honor. That is, if you can stop it or help it, I will ask you to do it, that is, to hang me too. For I think it is more honorable to die suddenly than to be killed by inches. I have a family and children, and if they know their father is dead, they will bury him. They can go to the grave and kneel down by the side of it, but they can't go to the penitentiary and see their father, who is convicted of a crime that he hasn't had anything to do with. That is all I have to say, Your Honor. I am sorry I am not to be hung with the rest of the men."
That is some spicy-ass discourse.